So much for being here today. We are going to be doing a financial aid presentation on the FAFSA and the Minnesota DREAM Act. I'm Kat, the Outreach and Communications Coordinator at the Office of Higher Education. This is Beth Barsis, and what is your title again?
I am the PSU and Concurrent Enrollment Specialist at the Department of Education, which is just part of my role, and then I do College Knowledge Month and FAFSA with Kat for Minnesota Goes to College.
Yep, and we have Meghan Flores here, who is the manager of the financial aid programs at the Office of Higher Education. So without further ado, I will let them get started and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much, Kat. Hi, everyone. Again, as Kat mentioned, my name is Meghan Flores. I work here at the Office of Higher Education. I've been here for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I worked on college campuses, administering federal, state, and institutional financial aid programs for about 20 years. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm not sure if all of you found your way to the bathroom when you come in, but if you can't really go anywhere but within our suite without a scan card, so you're kind of stuck with us for a couple hours. But if you go outside our doors and go left and go right, the women's room is the first one, and then if you just follow the curved glass, you will eventually reach the men's room. So that's logistics. I'm pretty informal, so I know it's a long time to sit, and it's kind of content-heavy material we're going to go through. So if you feel uncomfortable or the chair's not giving your body what it needs and you want to stand up or pace or walk, I have a couple tiny humans at home, so I'm used to a little bit of commotion, and it won't bother me at all. I won't be offended either. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about the FAFSA and the Minnesota DREAM Act. In Minnesota, in our state, there are two ways to apply for financial aid. One way is the FAFSA, and the other way is the Minnesota DREAM Act application. Which application you use depends on your situation. So we're going to talk about each of those today. We're also going to go over the changes to the 2020-2021 FAFSA, which I've realized already is kind of hard to get out when you're saying it out loud. How many of you have worked with the FAFSA or financial aid college going process for less than a year? Okay, how many, like a week or two? Very, very new. Okay, how many have worked 3 to 5 years with the process? Okay, and then how about 5 to 10? Okay, what about 15 or more? Okay, and so we have quite a bit of different experience here. I will try not to go too far into our alphabet soup. If I do, totally call me out on it and just be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so for those of you who are newer, the FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. This is a resource and application that's managed by the United States Department of Education, and it is available annually. It is the way that anyone in the United States who is a U.S. citizen, permanent resident, or eligible non-citizen applies for financial aid. So it's kind of our universal application here in the United States. It does change slightly each year, so there's a new version. That application cycle starts October 1st. We're going to talk today a little bit about some of the changes. We'll get into, again, some of that alphabet soup with the federal student aid ID, with the data retrieval tool. We're going to actually go through a demo of the FAFSA, which is publicly available to anyone in this room, so you feel free to go back and take a peek at it or share it with your colleagues or anyone that is helping with FAFSA presentations. And then we're going to talk about the Minnesota DREAM Act. We will make sure within the presentation to answer any questions you might have. It's not a hard and fast rule that we have to wait to the end. And so if you have questions as we go, it's very possible someone else is wondering that as well. So I'm fine taking those as we go as well. Oops. Okay, so the big changes in the FAFSA for this coming year, there are no new questions, which is a good news. So it's not anything that will be radically different for those of you who've worked with the application in the past. However, 2 years ago in the 2018-2019 cycle, the myFAFSA mobile app was introduced. That was introduced as a beta version mid-cycle. And then this current 19-20 year was the first academic year where it was fully available. Now leading into its second year, the app will now be fully synchronized with the FAFSA on the web or the FAFSA.gov website, so that if a student maybe saves their FAFSA and started working on it on a desktop potentially and then moves over to the app, that it should sync up. And so that's something that now should be a little bit easier to kind of toggle between the two. One thing I will note though is because a lot of times I'll mention you kind of have to think like the computer. So you can't be logged into the desktop and then also pull up your phone and use the app, because it just can't take the data from both at the same time. So it isn't something where, a parent could have the app and the student could have the app and they'd both be in the same FAFSA doing it. It just will confuse it and create problems. The IRS data retrieval tool is now mobile responsive, so that should help with some issues. We'll talk in a little bit more about what is the data retrieval tool. The SSN is now masked for both the mobile app as well as the FAFSA.gov website. So by default, the student who's filing the FAFSA will not be able to see the numbers that they type in. However, there is a little checkbox. And I would probably, if they're not, at an internet cafe, recommend they use that checkbox. The reason for that being that a very common error on the FAFSA is that a student inadvertently transposes just one or two numbers. And so that can create problems down the road. I see some heads nodding, so we've had that experience with our students. And then the kind of what I think will be the bigger challenge or newness to the FAFSA will be that since the FAFSA uses what is called prior year, or peeks back at 2 years old tax data, there were significant changes with the Federal Tax Act of 2017 that impacted the 2018 tax return forms, the 1040s. So specifically, there is no longer a 1040A or a 1040EZ tax form. Every tax filer in the United States now files a 1040. And so you won't see those references on the FAFSA. If you recall in previous years, it would give in the directions, if you did a 1040, look at this line. If you did a 1040A, look at this line, if you did the EZ. So now it is only going to be referring to the 1040. A new schedule or a question was repurposed, I should say. The one that said before, are you eligible to file the 1040A or EZ, has now been repurposed to be, did you file a Schedule 1? And the reason for that is related to one of the things the FAFSA does is called the Federal Needs Analysis. It's a formula approved by Congress to give a predictor of a family's ability to pay for college. Most of us who work in the field agree it doesn't accurately represent a family's ability to pay, but it's more closely associated with an index. It's a measure of a family's ability to pay. Everyone's measured through the same formula. And really what that's doing is letting the aid administrator on campus know what the eligibility is for federal, state, and institutional aid. And so that needs analysis formula, there's a way where a student can get what's called an automatic zero EFC, or maybe a simplified needs where they're not even going to look at the family's assets. And so it's just a way that tells the FAFSA with smart logic how to skip certain questions, because we know that this family is in a situation where even if they have assets, they're not readily available because maybe they have free or reduced lunch, or maybe they have some other situation. So that's what that Schedule 1 question does. The exemptions are removed. The references to how many exemptions did you claim on your taxes, because that's no longer a thing with the new tax forms. And then the foreign return answer was adjusted to align with the new name of that form. And then the combined untaxed pensions and untaxed portions of IRA used to be 2 questions, it's now 1. So those are really the only changes we've seen in the FAFSA form. As far as the myStudent Aid mobile app, new this year, schools and financial aid administrators, when we get our version of the FAFSA, it's called the ICER. So those of you who've worked in a college campus will be familiar with that language. It's the Institutional Student Information Record, right? Yeah, okay, I always forget that one. And that is something where now we're going to be able to see if a student filed the FAFSA via FAFSA.gov or FAFSA on the web, or if they filed via the app. So we'll be able to start to see some analysis and trends down the road of, is the mobile app really helping us with the digital divide? Are we being able to reach different communities in different ways? Who's using it, who's not? Those kinds of things is now being built out. We talked already about the different versions of it a little bit. I would say I do the testing for the state of Minnesota for the FAFSA this summer before it comes out in October. And I did, in my experience, found if you open your mobile device and just open a web browser, you can go to FAFSA.gov. It's not a really great experience. It's not, if you're going to use a mobile device, I guess my recommendation would be download the app. You're going to have a much easier, less frustrating process rather than, although you technically could fill out a FAFSA on the web using your mobile devices, internet browser. The role is very important for your students who are filing via the mobile app. When you first open up the application, it's going to say either I am a student, I am a parent, or I am the preparer. You are our FAFSA helpers, but you're not a preparer. That's someone who's professionally paid to file a FAFSA. So if students or families inadvertently end up at FAFSA.com, that is a FAFSA website that you pay to do the FAFSA. So make sure they're going to the .gov site. There are issues if you do not have pop-up blockers allowed. So for example, when you are within the FAFSA and you go out to the IRS data retrieval tool, or for example, we have a state questionnaire that some of our schools participate in, that won't open if pop-up blockers aren't allowed. So it is advisable that those are turned on. And then one new feature to the app. So the app is actually called myStudent. The myFAFSA is a component embedded within the application. There are several other functions and features within the myStudent app. That myStudent app is supported by the federal student aid. That's the department within the United States Department of Education that kind of does everything related to the FAFSA. The myStudent aid mobile app also, the master promissory note can be completed or viewed from within there. There's some functionality being built out for that. You know, there's the potential for down the road that maybe loan forgiveness program applications could happen through that venue. The student aid report, the SAR, that's basically the student's response to filing the FAFSA that tells them this is what you told us, here's the, you know, the numbers and the data you gave us, lets them know right away if they're Pell eligible, if they have any issues with the behind the scene checks that are done, and also lets them know other important information like that they're selected for verification. That student aid report will be available within the app now this year.
Did you say that FAFSA.com is where you can pay for someone to fill out your
Yeah,
What's,
you know, anybody can buy a
situation where
URL. It's
Yeah.
public domain, and so somebody early on bought that domain, and it's you pay to do your FAFSA. So we don't want our students doing that. FAFSA stands for free application for federal student aid. So we want to make sure they're all going and know that it's free. This is a free application. Yeah. If a student makes an error on their FAFSA and they need to make a correction, that cannot yet be done within the app. So the corrections still need to go to the FAFSA on the web. So they still would have to go to a desktop for that. How many of you are familiar with the FSA or the Federal Student Aid ID process? Okay, this is something that I love to tell our community partners. It's a great enabling homework assignment for a student, right? So if they want some FAFSA help, or if you want to give them a to-do action step, or their parent or guardian or their helper who's going to be on the FAFSA and action step, having that FSA ID number ahead of time before they come to meet with you to do the FAFSA or to come to a FAFSA completion event. There are a lot of, I think that the feds have done better in the last 5 years or so to create much better content for all of us as a community to use. They have some really great videos. They have a YouTube channel. They have little social media pushes you can do. In your handouts, there is a resource for FSA, which is a toolkit for counselors and financial aid folks that you can kind of get emails pushed to you about when this content becomes available. And the toolkit itself has access to a lot of those. So if at your schools or the community orgs that you're representing have social media channels and they want to push out videos, there is a really great one about how to do your FSA ID. So you don't have to reinvent that or recreate it. The ID process can take up to 3 days, so that's why I say it's a great homework assignment for students and families to do ahead of time. And it kind of, again, gives them a little bit of ownership over the process. You do have to use that whether you're doing the FAFSA on the web or you're using the mobile app option. As long as it's not lost or compromised, that federal student aid ID number stays with them. And so it's something that's unique to each individual student with their name, their social security, and their date of birth. And then, of course, the parent, only one parent needs one if it's a two-parent household. And theirs would be unique to their name, their social security and their date of birth. So the student has one and the parent has their own. The parent can use theirs for multiple children. The student uses that same FSA ID to sign the master promissory note if they borrow student loans and other functions that they could do in that myStudent mobile app. If for any reason your student feels that their FSA ID has been compromised or maybe someone else is using it, they want to report that immediately. And that would be to the feds. The data retrieval tool, this has not changed significantly. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, once you're within the FAFSA application, there's an option to leave the FAFSA, go out to the IRS, grab your taxpayer information and pull it into the FAFSA. When that data comes over, it is masked, so the student and parent cannot see the numbers that are put in. And that's a security enhancement that the IRS has added. And so they can't see that. And the benefit to doing that is if the student is later selected for a process called verification, they don't have to separately provide tax documents to the school. If they bring over that data from the IRS data retrieval and just continue with the FAFSA, they won't have to turn in documentation that that data was correct because it came right from the IRS. Most students and parents can use it. There are a couple scenarios where they can't. The first year this rolled out, it was very kind of clunky in that we were not yet in prior year. So there were a lot of issues of, well, how long had the tax return been at the IRS? Had enough time passed for that pull to work? Now that we're doing prior year, it's a little bit easier to get the data to pull through. One common situation that will be problematic, though, is that the address that you put into the data retrieval has to exactly match the address that's on the taxpayer's tax document. And it's very, very sensitive. If you think about like kind of how the computer match works, it has to see this as exactly the same to connect. And so, name spelling matters, whether you write street or ST matters. I know a lot of folks who are out there helping with FAFSA filing say, you know, we'll just try a couple ways if it doesn't work. We'll try spelling out street, we'll try it with abbreviation. I've also heard folks say they've had success if they go to the United States Postal Service website and see what the address they say is. I know, for example, some folks who live in Roseville, it says St. Paul. So it's kind of a little bit challenging in that way. If they have their tax forms with them, it can be a little bit more helpful. One last thing I wanted to mention about that, for financial aid administrators, there was what is called verification relief. And that means that again, for the 2021 cycle, for the students who are selected for verification, if they didn't use the data retrieval tool, they can provide signed copies of tax forms instead of ordering the tax transcript. Schools can still accept the text transcript, but it's an or statement. So you'll probably more likely when you start working with your students, if they get flagged for verification, see, okay, you need to verify your income. Here's a couple of ways. But it should include both the tax transcript as well as the tax return, the 1040. Are there any questions about the federal student aid ID or the IRS data retrieval tool or anything we've talked about so far? Okay. So I'm assuming because you're here, you all want to be our partners in helping with the FAFSA. There are some tips that came from actually that federal student aid toolkit that I was telling you about. They have a listserv where they'll send out some information. These are some of the things that they have shared for folks who have been doing FAFSA completion events across the country as far as what would be best practices so you eliminate any kind of frustrations the day of. One really important one is that a lot of schools or maybe community centers or nonprofit community organizations that are holding FAFSA completion events might have firewalls or safety mechanisms in place. So for example, at certain schools, you can't go to certain URLs. You know, it's very secure in that way that they don't want students going to certain sites or doing certain things. And so you probably do want to have someone from if you're doing it at a school or a community place, maybe have the IT person there, or you yourself go and test first to make sure that you're not going to have issues the night of the event. One way to do that, to make sure that there aren't any web proxies or filters that are going to create issues, is the FAFSA on the web demo that we're going to go through today. Again, that's publicly available. It's probably a good idea to test that on site before your event, just to make sure that if there are any issues, you can work with your IT to address those, or maybe, get some clearance to be able to allow pop-ups, allow cookies, whatever it is you need to do for a certain day or hours of that day when you have your event. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and open up the FAFSA Demo website. As I mentioned, this is a publicly available website. It's hosted by the Federal Student Aid Division of the U.S. Department of Education. They do have out here pre-populated test information. So if you see down here, there's both 2019, 2020, as well as 2020, 2021 FAFSA information, so you can look at either. For today's purposes, we're going to look at the 2021 FAFSA. So what I'm scrolling through here is just giving you FSA user IDs and passwords so that you can use them to log in, depending on if you want to look at a brand new application, a renewal application, if you want to look at a dependent student or an independent student. There's a couple of different options in there. And then you go to the very bottom here and you go to FAFSA on the web demo system. It's not uncommon that it takes a little bit of a while to load. So the first piece you're going to see is whether or not you're a parent or a preparer, or if you're a student. So for our purposes today, we're going to say that we're a student. And I'm going to go ahead and use the FSA user ID, username, and password that was on that previous web page we were on. Oops. Okay, so the first page we see is the disclaimer, making sure that the student is, to the best of their knowledge, providing true and accurate information, that they intend to use financial aid for the purposes of paying for college. This student here, since I selected Harvey, who's a renewal applicant, it's going to show that he has a 2019-2020 application out there from the current aid year, as well as the one for the next academic year, 2021. And you can see that right here it tells Harvey right away that you started a 2020-2021 FAFSA but have not yet submitted it. Do you want to continue to where you left off? So this is because we used this test case yesterday, so I'm going to just start over so that we can see more things. And this says, okay, we didn't find a FAFSA for you for 2021. So we're going to go ahead and do the renewal FAFSA. The save key is something that's helpful if the student maybe is in a computer lab, or their browser might time out, or they're in the kitchen and there's a lot of commotion going on. This lets them get back in to where they saved it at.
Do they set up that on their own?
Yep, and it takes anything you want. I always use the word test, so I just put that in.
Does that ask them when they hit the save button? It asks, do you want to set up a save key?
Yep, and it will never ask that again. So just ask this in the beginning. Do you want to use the save key? When we get into the questions, I'll show you where it's helpful. This first introductory page just kind of gives them a lot of information about if they want help completing their FAFSA, how long it takes, can they save it and come back to it. Lets them know you can save it for up to 45 days. So if maybe they get into it and they start filling out some materials and they realize, oh, I don't have what I need to do this, they can always come back to the FAFSA and keep working on it. Lets them know ahead of time what kind of documents. There's a checklist that you can open and print or save, or maybe even if you wanted to, as friendly FAFSA helpers, send them this ahead of time, bring this with you to our FAFSA completion event or something like that. And then it talks about signing the FAFSA, that at the end of the application, both the student and the parent, if they're a dependent student, need to agree to the FAFSA statement and sign the application. They can do it using the federal student aid ID. They also have the option of creating it right here if they want. I think it's easier to have them do it separate, personally. That's been my experience. So the first thing I kind of want to point out too is that you can see right up here at the top, there's these different sections. That's where that save key is helpful, because what will happen is, let's say we get through the whole first tab here, it will turn green and the check mark will be right here, and then it will move to the school selection. So if you're using that save key when you go back in, the section you already completed will be saved. If you ever have a student who wants to just completely start over, like maybe they log back in and they say, you know what, that's not the correct social security number, they can reset their FAFSA. Just keep in mind that clears everything on the FAFSA. It doesn't just clear the tab that you're in. So since this one's a renewal FAFSA, Harvey's name, last name, social security number, and date of birth are already pre-populated. I chose to do a dependent student so that we would have more questions to take a look at. Again, a renewal student, so it pre-populated Harvey's phone number and email from the previous aid year. One thing for students coming right from high school is they might be using the school-assigned, high school-assigned email, so it's really a good idea to tell the students, if depending on your school's policy, of how long you let them keep that email and how long they're actually going to check it, to maybe set up a Gmail account or something separate and different and use that for the college pursuit process, both for application and financial aid purposes. They can always come back in and edit it or update it. Again, an opportunity to update the address if that has since changed.
I have a question about that too. I'm sorry, I have all the questions.
That's okay.
So you said the address has to match exactly on the tax form?
That's actually only for the data retrieval piece.
Okay, so
So
what happens
for
if
this
they
it doesn't.
move between filing their taxes and doing
They still, for the data retrieval tool, you still have to use the taxes that were on the tax form. So if you again think like the computer doesn't know that the student moved.
Right.
The IRS computer only knows the tax address that was on the tax form. Definitely. So here there's a couple of different residency questions. One thing I want to point out while we're here is that there's this question mark you see after each question. You can always expand that and it's going to open up a new page and give you more information about that particular question. So this one is describing what their legal residence was, where they have a true and fixed home. But on any of the questions, you can always check that part if you're not sure what the question's asking. Another resource that I have found is really helpful. It's not yet available for 2020, 2021, but there's a resource that the federal student aid puts out called Completing the FAFSA. The regular FAFSA is not that many pages. So if you actually print a paper copy, which is about 10 pages, there are some more details that are written here about the questions they're asking, but the Completing the FAFSA document is, I want to say, maybe 80 pages or so. It's thicker. It's every single question with a full paragraph or two explanation of what is that question actually asking, and gives you a little bit more context. A lot of times you'll hear me say that you don't have to know everything to help with higher education and FAFSA, but you have to know something and then where to look. There are certain things on the FAFSA that I will just never commit to memory because I don't have enough storage space. And so I just, get asked a question maybe once a year. I'll give you a common example. Whose asset is the 529? When that first came out, that's a college savings plan. It went back and forth. One year it was the parents, then it was the students, and I think it changed again. And I just decided at that moment I'm not going to memorize it. And so I will pull out, and a lot of times that's one of the things I don't like to print a lot, but I carry a printed copy of that if I go to an event, because I want to have that really full, comprehensive guide that when I get asked that one-off question, I can at least go to the source and there's a lot of context there. Since nothing changed too much from 2019, 2020, I would advise you could go get that for the time being, and then when it comes out, get the 2021, because those tax questions will be important. What's it called again? It's called Completing the FAFSA, and for, probably 15 years, I've never been able to find it on the actual FSA website. I don't know if anyone else knows where it is, but I just Google completing the FAFSA and put in the aid year and somehow I find it. So that would be what I'd recommend. So these questions here are related to the high school diploma and the college program they're working on, whether or not they'll have a bachelor's degree. We don't tend to get too many questions about this piece of it. Occasionally a student will confuse getting a bachelor's degree with a high school diploma. That is something that's important to correct because it impacts certain kinds of aid the student might be eligible for. The school year, schools are generally using this to know what grade level to assign or award student loans for. So that's what that piece is for. If it later changes the school, that's a common FAFSA element that a school might correct, maybe for a transfer student, depending on the number of transfer credits that come in. The interested in work study, I will typically tell students just to always check yes if they're unsure. Now, if they know for sure they're not going to use it, they can definitely put no, but if they're unsure, it's better to check yes and potentially get offered work study and then later decline it. Work study is a campus-based program, both a federal program as well as the state program. And so there are a limited amount of work study dollars that go to each campus and it is typically awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. So that's why I'll typically tell students, just check yes if you're not sure. It's not obligating you to work or signing you up for a job per se.
Do you know what happens if a student clicks don't know? Are they then just like put in line underneath all the students who click yes?
That would depend on the school.
Okay.
So if it's a campus-based program, the school really is deciding how they're awarding it. My assumption though would be that schools are probably going to give it to people who say, yes, I want it first. The male-female question is related to the requirement for the FAFSA for males between ages 18 to 25 to register with Selective Service, and this is the gender assigned at birth, is the way the feds are currently interpreting this one. There is the option from within the system to go ahead and register if the student isn't registered. So if you say, no, I'm not registered, but yeah, I want you to just sign me up for it. Mm-hmm. You could have them registered and then they would push it out.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So even if their birthday is like maybe months in advance.
Yeah, and I think it says right here, the other thing is they can just register themselves online.
Okay, so they don't have to be 18 to say yes.
I do not believe so.
Okay.
No, I think that they just then send it off.
So then would you advise for me to go and correct with that student in the future too? Like if he's going to turn, 18 before he graduates, right?
So if he says, no, I don't want to take care of it right now, I want to do it later, what will happen is that first aid year, probably if it's the FAFSA is processed when they're 17, it wouldn't show up on their student aid report and say you need to go register. But if his school made a correction or if he later went out and maybe added a school, which would create a new transaction or version of the FAFSA, it's going to pick up that he's now 18 and he'll get a comment on his student aid report that says, now you're 18, you need to go register. Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify, if you are 18 to 25 and not registered, are you denied financial aid?
You are.
Correct?
Yep. Yeah, and that question actually, we get a lot of questions about it, mostly because students don't understand what it is. I know in my lifetime the draft has never been active, and so there has been some conversations at the federal level to remove that question from the FAFSA. It's also a requirement of the Minnesota DREAM Act, so if that legislation happened at the federal level, we would then request a technical amendment to our state statute to adjust that. But for now, it's there. The driver's license one, I believe, is related to some states who have certain state residency requirements tied to that. If you just skip it, for purposes of Minnesota, it doesn't impact us. We don't look at that for residency. And so they can choose to enter it or not. The question about the foster youth, this is a question that helps schools identify additional resources and additionally if there's additional programs that are specific or earmarked towards foster youth. That's why that's asked. The question about the high school parents, this is more the high school level of the parent, excuse me. This has to do with kind of statistical modeling and data analytics that the feds do related to who's first generation. It also, some schools might potentially be using that for their own awarding of their own institutional or school-based resources.
Do you know an example of one of the foster youth resources a school would provide?
It wouldn't be from the school, it would more likely be from a county
Okay.
or from a state agency or from a federal agency.
Okay.
But there are some resources that are earmarked. And you can go right here to find the contact information for your state's child welfare agency. And then they would have resources there. I do believe there's a section on the Minnesota Office of Higher Education's website. I did have a foster youth recently contact me about that. And she was, it was something through her county, actually, that she was eligible for to help with higher education.
Nice, like a scholarship or something?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then Megan, can I ask for the parent information?
Yep.
That biological parent info right there?
You know, the FAFSA probably doesn't care
Okay. And then is it?
because they're not connecting it to anything really. It's just more they're trying to help schools identify who's first generation.
Okay. And when you're working with a student, is it highest level of what advice would you give a student? Is the highest level of education of a parent in the United States or all?
I think all. I mean, we typically, from the financial aid perspective, we consider all higher education education. We might not have the best systems in place to translate it or to apply the skills and knowledge, but that's another day. This question is just trying to figure out if a student has or hasn't received financial aid. And the reason why is because then there's an additional eligibility question related to if you have been convicted for the possession or sale of illegal drugs for an offense that occurred while you were receiving federal student aid. And that becomes a problem or a barrier for the student if that offense happened, and again, it's the conviction happened while they're receiving federal aid, because then they're then shut out from receiving future federal aid while that conviction's there. So
So if they ever have a felony conviction, they can't get federal aid.
if they're convicted of possession or sale of illegal drugs, it ends up asking them another one to see if it was a federal or state drug-related conviction, if it was removed from the record. If it's removed from the record, then it's fine. If it's not, I believe it asks us another question. Oops. Where it says, based on the answer you provided, we've determined that your eligibility for federal aid is not affected by the previous question. So if you're convicted of possessing or selling drugs after you submit your FAFSA, you have to notify the financial aid office, and you will lose eligibility, and you have to pay back the aid. So it's if that's if
Has that always been?
this was new in 2014. Do you remember? Does anybody remember? It's been there for a while. Yeah, this was a renewal student. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I just want to wrap my whole head around this. If they have a drug conviction and they were previously receiving financial aid, they have to pay that back?
It's
And
if they
then-
get the offense while they're receiving the
Yes,
aid currently.
right.
Yeah,
And then also, then they cannot receive any further aid.
that's correct. Yep.
Wow.
But if it, I'm sorry, I was kind of missing what you guys were saying, but if it's like a brand new student that's applying and maybe they have that conviction,
They wouldn't have been receiving financial aid during the time when they received the conviction.
But
Yeah.
then they're still not eligible.
Yeah, what I would recommend if you have students with that situation is to go to that completing the FAFSA document and read over that really thoroughly to see. Federal student aid might also provide a decision tree. A lot of times they'll have on their website these kind of flow charts. I'm not sure if there's one in your handout packet, but they look, if you've seen the one for who's a parent on the FAFSA, is that one in your handout? It looks like this, where it kind of has the question and then it says, you know, if yes, then this, if no, then this. I believe there's one like this for that drug conviction question. So if you have students that you believe will be impacted by this, I would get that handout and make sure that you have it with you.
Can I ask when it says period of enrollment, so say that you got a drug conviction or something during the summertime while you're not enrolled in school.
Well, then you technically wouldn't be in a period of enrollment and you were not receiving financial aid at that time. So answering no, the offense didn't occur during that period of enrollment would be accurate.
Does that mean then that person can still receive federal benefit and they don't have to pay it back?
My understanding is yes, but I don't administer federal financial aid. So that's why I would recommend if you have these specific questions to go to the federal resource to check on it. We don't tend to get very many questions about this at the Office of Higher Education. I've actually never had a question about this. We do have some colleagues who work in the state agency level below us as the Department of Corrections, and they do have some initiatives and legislative proposals related to trying to get this addressed in a different way or for it to be perceived and pursued differently. And so those are some current things that the Department of Corrections is working on with the governor's office. Okay, so if you see now that we finished through the student demographics with the green check mark, we have finished that section, so the student shouldn't have to recomplete it. They can open it back up and work on it again or change answers if they want, but now it moved us over to the next one. So this one, since again we did a renewal student, it's again reminding the student whenever we talk about you and your, we're always talking about the student. We're not talking about the parent. We do know there are parents out there who get the FSA ID, they create it for their student, they file the student's FAFSA, they do all that. We cannot prevent that from happening. That's all I'm going to say about that. As long as we get the application, I don't care who helps them. That's just me personally. This here allows them to list up to 10 schools. Do you know, kind of as a standard, what are all of you telling your students for how many schools to list? Is there something that you're kind of saying, hey, fill out every single spot, or do you usually tell them pick 3 or 4? Depends, okay. I do think that sometimes it can be overwhelming for a student if they fill out 10, but they really have no intention of applying to all 10 schools, or maybe some of them are out of state and it's just not going to be something, they don't want to live out of state, but that sounded like a good school to put down. The information does go to the school's financial aid office, and then they could potentially start receiving email and print mail from that school, which sometimes can be a little bit overwhelming if you're getting so much at you from so many directions. So what I generally tell students and parents is just list the schools that you're really actually considering and you actually would potentially go to. You can always add schools later. For purposes of the FAFSA, school order does not matter. We used to tell students and families, always list your first choice school first. And the reason for that was in the past, when the version of the FAFSA that goes to the schools was sent, the school's financial aid office could see every school that was listed. So they basically knew who they were competing against. Some financial aid offices or some schools were giving different awards to different students based on that ranking. And the feds found out about it and did not like that. And they said, you don't really have a need to know who else that student listed. You know, it's not really your business. In order for you to determine eligibility for federal financial aid, it's not relevant. So we don't want you to have that data. And so they now have that mass, so the schools don't see who else was listed on the FAFSA. So school order doesn't really matter anymore. For the Minnesota DREAM Act, it does, and we'll talk about that when we get to that application. So just for the purposes of today, I'm just going to go ahead and select Minnesota. And if you just go to search and only put in the state, for example, if the student doesn't know the school code, it's going to give you all of the schools in our state. And there are several pages listed here. So just again, oops, not great with the Mac. For our purposes, I'm just going to click a couple. You can view the college information here. It will give some general consumer information about it, link to the website, provide some of what's called the college scorecard information if they're participating. If students don't want to, link on things and get pulled down a web rabbit hole, they can just print the page and look at it later. You can also just close it. For For each school listed, it's separately going to ask the housing plan. This may make a difference for campus-based financial aid that's awarded to the student. So it's really just asking, where do you plan to live when you go to that particular school? Again, we completed one section, so the green check mark appeared and we moved to the next question. I would say if you legitimately believe you might live on campus, yes. Because again, some institutions do provide, typically it costs more to live on campus, so some schools will give you more financial aid if you say you're living on campus. If the student really in the scope of things never will live on campus, I don't know that it's helpful to the student to help inform their decision. But you know, if the student wants to say, well, if it was possible and I had enough resources, I would live on campus, then I think absolutely. For the dependency status, so the FAFSA dependency status is not the same thing as dependent as the way that the IRS or the taxes look at it. And so being dependent for IRS tax purposes is completely separate and different from the U.S. Department of Education's view of dependency status. The FAFSA and the federal aid process are designed around the premise that to the extent they are able, parents have the primary obligation of educating their children. Financial aid programs exist when that ability is either not present or is limited. And so that is essentially what the FAFSA is designed to do. It's measuring the ability, the resources for that family unit that are available to help pay for college. And it's measuring everyone through that same formula the exact same way. The dependency questions, I believe there are 10. There is another flow chart like this. There's also in your handouts the series of the 10 questions of what makes someone dependent or independent. And we'll take a look at those now. One of them is being married. So for our purposes, we'll say the student's single. As you answer each dependency question, it's going to bring up the other dependency questions. As soon as one of them, makes the student independent, it's not going to ask the other questions. So this question is related to if the student has children who receive more than half of their support and will continue to receive that support through the financial aid award year. If they have dependents other than their child or spouse that will receive support, at least half of the support. This is the question that has the rest of the dependency, most of the rest of the dependency questions, asking about if they're active duty, if they're a veteran, if at any time since they were age 13, both of the parents were deceased or they were in foster care, if they were a dependent or ward of the court. And then for the legal residency, that would be if they're an emancipated minor in the court in their own state, so that would be Minnesota. For legal guardianship, this would be if it was determined in Minnesota that someone other than the parent or step-parent, has legal guardianship. And then if there are questions on those, the help topic here expands each of these. So this one doesn't have an individual question mark for each of them. It has one where everything's lumped into one. They would need that, I believe it's called the DD 214 that tells them. They get a military paperwork from the military that tells them. So typically most students know if they're active duty or not. My understanding of it is that if you've just completed basic training but haven't been called up to duty, that you are not active duty military.
Depends if you're enlisted active duty or reserve usually. Like
Yeah.
If you did National Guard, you'd probably not be on active duty.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's the way you went in.
And we see a lot of Minnesota National Guard. It's more common, I guess, of what I've experienced. This question here is about if the student is homeless or was self-supporting or at risk of being homeless. This has kind of been what we would consider probably a hot topic in financial aid because I think there's a lot more awareness of the housing and food insecurity that our students, both in the K through 12 level as well as that carries into the higher education level, are experiencing. Because a lot of times students don't really use that terminology for themselves, they don't always know or call themselves homeless. They might just have insecure or not regular or fixed adequate housing. So a lot of time these conversations with students can be very difficult and very emotional to kind of just talk through the situation. And it's really about just trying to find out what resources are available to you and what you're eligible for, and making sure that we get you what you need to be successful. The explanation here, I think, is pretty good in that it really lets the student or whoever is helping know that homeless, according to the FAFSA, is that if you do not have fixed, regular, and adequate housing, that if you kind of are going between spaces, and it names a variety of them, or maybe just living temporarily, maybe with an aunt and then you go to a cousin's, all these different situations our students might be in. And they also do make a point to include if you're fleeing an abusive parent, that you might be considered homeless even if your parent would otherwise let you live with them. And so that's something that will come up. And we had 2 questions here.
Yeah, so how about students who I guess is living on their own, like in an apartment, but they're like, I guess they could be you know what I'm saying?
So the question was, what about if a student is living on their own in an apartment? So they're self-supporting, but unless they're at risk of homelessness or fleeing an abusive parent situation, they're not independent. Being financially independent from your parents is not one of the qualifications that make you independent on the FAFSA. And then there was another question?
We have a student who is a U.S. citizen. Parents are not living in Mexico. He's living with aunt, but aunt intends to possibly go back to Mexico in December. So maybe being at risk of being homeless.
So the FAFSA would be filled out as of the point in time what the student's situation is when they complete it. This who's my parent flow chart is helpful. You cannot make parents, grandparents, older siblings, or legal guardians parents on the FAFSA. And so you can't just take aunt's information and make the aunt the parent on the FAFSA. The situation you described might be one where either one of 2 things could happen. Sometimes a financial aid administrator will find out if the parent filed a foreign tax return. They might just be physically separated and filing taxes elsewhere. I had a situation with that this year where we used the Venezuelan tax returns and we just did a currency conversion. I've done that with parents who are in China. We'll just do a currency conversion. There are other times where it might make more sense, where the financial aid administrator might exercise what's called professional judgment, and that is done on an individual case-by-case basis at the discretion of the financial aid office. So it could vary from school to school. But that aid administrator would have the opportunity to do what's called a dependency override, where even though the student technically can't answer yes to one of those yes or no dependency questions on the FAFSA, something about that situation is where that aid administrator collects third-party, non-biased documentation to document the non-voluntary severance in the parent-child relationship. And so through that documentation, that aid administrator might exercise professional judgment and do a dependency override to then consider that student independent and not require parent information on the FAFSA. Yep. Yep, and it depends again on the student situation. It might be that they have income, but they're not filing taxes because their country doesn't require it. I know for the Minnesota DREAM Act, sometimes we just get a letter or an email from the parent with what that income is. Sometimes we end up doing the dependency override. It's a very individual case-by-case situation. In the case of the FAFSA, if it's a U.S. citizen or permanent resident and they're doing the FAFSA, they would want to reach out to the financial aid office. There is an option within the FAFSA to say I'm unable to provide my parent information, but you can still submit it. So the FAFSA is submitted, and then the school gets that answer that says I can't provide information, and then should be following up with the student to find out what the situation is. And they might present that dependency override as a potential. I would then advise your students to also, on their own, proactively follow up with the school, though.
It's very common. A lot of the colleges have a third-party verification.
Yep.
As counselors, we've done it multiple times.
Yep.
Explain the situation.
So I'm just going to repeat since we're recording it. The comment was that a lot of high school counselors, we also have college access counselors. You could all be the third-party unbiased source that writes the letter to potentially say, you know, I've been working with Meghan for 2 or 3 years. Through my relationship with her in a counseling capacity, I got to know more information about her and her family. She shared some information with me that impacts her eligibility or ability to put information on the FAFSA. and then you're on your letterhead for your high school or the community org you work for, you can send that letter in to the financial aid office. Don't send any of that documentation or any of those interactions to the federal student aid or to the central processor, because they don't make the decision. It's done on an individual, case-by-case basis through the financial aid office. Yep. But it's not that uncommon. I mean, it's probably one of the most common professional judgments that a financial aid administrator will do. But it's just a matter of getting the documentation. Some schools have developed a form, so they might have a professional judgment request or a special circumstances form right on their financial aid website. One of those special circumstances could be, I've even seen schools where, you know, they'll have, okay, change of income, death of a parent, additional family member in the household, or dependency override. And you're kind of checking a box of, well, which of these is my special circumstance? Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
For this question, I think before if you said yes, it would pop up like a series of other questions, right?
Yep. I will show you those two. So if you say that, yes, I am homeless or I am self-supporting and at risk of homelessness, and you hit, excuse me, I'm going to say no because that's when it pops up the other questions. There's a couple more where it will ask. Oops. Let me check. Okay, so these are the additional questions when we put yes. So
Are there things to any additional stuff? And like, for instance, I think the one that I usually have them check is your high school or school district homeless liaison.
yeah, so that would be if you have the McKinney-Vento Act, if there's someone at your high school who has that designation for the student. They can provide paperwork to the student. So that's what that one would be. But it might be something different. You know, it doesn't have to be that's the way that they have the designation. It could be this one, where the director of an emergency shelter or transitional housing program has determined that. They receive that determination from that individual, you know, or it could be that the director of a runaway or homeless youth basic one did it. If you say none of the above, I believe then it asks another question. Let's check. So this one says you indicated that you were homeless or at risk of homelessness and you answered none of the above when presented with the specific homeless questions. And so this is where they probably will then indicate that you need to go to the financial aid administrator and they will decide. Most of our aid administrators in Minnesota use a tool that's been provided at the national level. It's basically an interview tool that the aid administrator can go through with a student to ask questions about, okay, so, you know, where do you live? Who are you living with? How are you providing your basic needs? How are you meeting those needs? Who's with you? So they're basically determining that they're homeless and also that they're unaccompanied. And then the second part of the form, you know, and they sign it and say, you know, Meghan Flores, this, you know, I had this interview with Beth and she shared this information with me. And then the second half of the form has information about resources. So it kind of prompts the financial aid administrator to refer the student to resources. And I believe there's a section about, you know, food support programs on campus. It could be housing support programs. It might be something where they're interacting with, if they are on campus, maybe a res life coordinator to talk about what happens during breaks. Are the dormitories still open? Can the students still stay with us? Is there safety and security provided? And just kind of forces that student and aid administrator to help the institution help the student, one, but two, also figure out a plan. What are you going to do over the summer? What kind of resources or referrals can we make? And so that's the most common one you would see happening at the campus level. We do also, unfortunately, have situations where maybe that first year of high school, the student, you know, doesn't say yes to this. Things seem to be relatively stable. This is an annual application, so that situation could change in a future year. Or it could be something, you know, I've even had situations where things, you know, it was hard to get the parents to give them the data for the FAFSA. It was hard to do it the first time. It was somewhat reluctant, but they at least got the form in and the student made it the first year. But then come end of the school year, the family had moved. The student didn't know where they were. They no longer had any contact. And things kind of fell apart in that regard. And so it might be, okay, well, now I'm living here, and then I'm living there, and then I'm living here. And the situation's different for the next year. So that can change, and that's not anything unreasonable or shouldn't be suspicious to anyone. It's just life happens. So that's why we have an annual application.
So going to the previous one where they have the three like options where if you say yes to homelessness, there's three options. So the student clicks one of those three. I guess my question is, what is the follow up that the college or students will have to do with that, or is there no follow up? Just so that
There
I
may
know
be.
what to tell students.
Yep. So if it's like, for example, the one that my high school liaison has designated me, they'll probably ask for the document. Depending on the school, this is a school-based process, so I'm not going to know every school's process. We do have through the Office of Higher Education a competitive grant where we give food security grants to campuses who are actively working on this. And it's a pilot right now. We're hoping to eventually expand it. There are some things at the national level happening that way. I guess I kind of usually tend to tell students, work directly with your school. You're going to probably need some additional supports to be successful. I usually tell students, I mean, you're paying for this education. In some cases, a lot of money. So your tuition bill covers other services that are available on campus. So you need to advocate for yourself and understand what's available to you so that you can set yourself up to be successful. And that can be kind of scary for the students. So sometimes it's helpful to make some of those calls together, or maybe, assign some homework, empower them, say, okay, well, here are your three school choices. Who's going to be able to help meet your needs? Are there additional programs or supports on campus? Those kinds of things. And help the student make a plan, right? Because once they're out of your sphere of influence, they're moving into a new territory where they don't have those pre-established relationships that you have made with them. And so it's just trying to think ahead. And, most of the students you're working with, I'm assuming, are about 17, 18 years old. So developmentally, cognitively, they're thinking like a 17 or 18-year-old. They're not processing these things at the high level we are. They're not going to know most of the time. Some are incredibly adept and have overcome a lot of adversity, and so they know how to manage themselves. But some don't. And so it's your relationship with that student kind of gauging, who do I need to nudge, who's on the path, who do I need to just put a couple, little ticklers in there and they'll take off running, and who do I need to really walk through this in a more hand-holding kind of way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So again, at the community, most fundamental grassroots level, you're going to know your students best and what they need. What does happen if they answer yes to that question is that then they are considered independent. The FAFSA is not going to ask them for those additional parent questions. This is the part where your question was about the student who maybe just is going to say, I can't answer yes to any of those questions, but I can't give the information. If they say I'm unable to provide the information, that's basically kind of saying, I have this special circumstance, even though those questions that I'm considered dependent, I'm just not able to give that information. When you select this button, I believe, and we'll check here, a new kind of paragraph says your school might follow up with you, do some next steps. If you continue to complete the app without parent information, we won't transfer parent information. We won't calculate your expected family contribution. You can still submit the FAFSA, but you won't get the expected family contribution, which means the aid administrator isn't going to be able to create a financial aid package for you. And that's why you need to, in order to find out what you are eligible for, you need to reach out to the aid administrator. I would say if you have students who are going to run into that, be proactive and find out ahead of time what some of the school's policies are.
So this individual school will still create financial aid package.
Not without the student contacting them.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
once they're contacted.
Yeah,
and
and they're probably going to have that similar conversation we had where they're going to kind of say, okay, you know what, Megan, I see that you couldn't put that information on your FAFSA. Tell me a little bit about what's going on. Tell me about what your situation is. And they might share just a couple, 2 or 3 things, and they might say, gosh, it sounds like you've had a severance in the relationship with your parent. Some of the students, they haven't lived there for 3-4 years. And so then it's a matter of, okay, how do we move forward?
Would the estimated family contribution number still show with it?
It would not. No. But so they'd get the submit date, which is important, right? Because they'd have a timestamp with their FAFSA being processed. But on our end, on the financial aid end, there's a C code, it's called. So we would have most schools will connect that with their document tracking system to ask for something further. Or they'll have a list of every student that did that and have to kind of just go through them. It's a bit of a manual process, so that's why I would encourage your student or you, if you're in that relationship with a student, to reach out ahead of time and find out what the process is. For our purposes today, we'll go ahead and just say we're going to provide the parent information. Since we're running close on time here, I'm just going to kind of see, are there questions about marital status? I mean, this is really asking if they're remarried. I guess the most common one that comes up with this, if they're remarried and there's a step parent, that step parent's information has to be whether or not the step parent agrees or wants to help or anything. If they're married, they're married. If they're unmarried and it's both the legal or adoptive or biological parents living with the student, if it doesn't matter if they're same gender parents or if they're not, it's just who are the two parents that live with the student, and really it's trying to get at who's the family unit and what are the resources available to pay for college.
I know this is true enough, but a student says that parents are divorced, but they still live together, you still would pick that though, right?
They're unmarried and if they're both the legal and biological or adoptive parents living together, both of their income counts. Yep.
Even if they say like, oh no, he's separate.
But they're still living under the same household, and so all those resources are going into the household. I mean, they could approach the financial aid office to see if they would view it differently, but I wouldn't. I mean, I'm getting the other financial aid administrator in the room. I mean, typically we would say that's the family unit. I mean, that's really what all this is about, is it's really just trying to see who's the family unit and what resources are available to that unit, and then how does that impact eligibility for aid. That's the whole premise of the FAFSA. So for this one, we'll just say that they're married so that we can kind of get a little bit further along here. This pre-populated it from last year, it looks like. Can't remember if it's going to make me put something in. This is asking about the parent's state of residency, which matters for state aid. This I'm just gonna, is asking about the household size.
In Minnesota, a parent, a legal resident is just live here, or what's their documents, or if they're illegal. If they have,
About, are you asking about household size or about resident of Minnesota?
it's a parent's resident.
Yep, for us, we just look at where do they live. Yeah, so if the parent lives in Minnesota, then we would count them that way.
Just follow up on that. So if the parents are married, but one of the parents lives in Mexico, the household size, but we can't change that. So what does it do?
Oh, this one, the reason you can't change it is because you said married, it just assumed two.
Yeah.
And so, and you're right, you can't change that because they're married.
So, but legal,
Even if they're physically separated, they're still married, and so both of their income counts. Again, we're getting at what is the family unit and what are the resources available. So if they're physically separated but still married, we're looking at all of that.
even though living in a different country.
Exactly. Yep, because they could still have income and they're still contributing potentially towards that. The household side question, actually, you know, there are a lot of questions about marriage, about maybe we filed taxes together, that was prior year, now we're divorced or separated. And so there is a whole section in that completing the FAFSA that talks about that. There's also a couple of infographics like this. There's a really great FSA video that talks about it too. So those are all resources that are available. And again, it's just kind of trying to get at who's the family unit and how many of the people in the family unit are going to college. There's no limit necessarily on the age. So if there are, you know, children who are 27 who are living at home with a parent or parents, they can still be counted in the household. They can still be counted in college. If there's grandma or a cousin or a niece or nephew who's living in the household and that family unit is supporting that individual, they can be counted in the family as well. So we'll just put some numbers in here so we can see the next questions. So the first piece is really asking about the tax filing status. And this is where we're going to get into, it's going to present the question related to the data transfer. These initial questions They would have to have their taxes with them to know, or maybe they have it memorized. Sorry, I don't use a Mac, so I'm not as familiar with how we make it move. So this is the link to the data retrieval tool.
So for parents who, I guess, were supposed to file didn't file, would you say?
If they earned the threshold of income where they're required to file taxes and they do not file taxes, they will not be able to get financial aid for their student.
So then for the, I guess, the selection rules, they would choose like welcome, is there one that like welcome?
Yeah, if they're really going to file, maybe they're just late in filing.
Yeah.
That's incredibly rare because now that we use prior tax years.
No, not late, but like they did file, so now they're like, oops, okay, I guess I should file, like, so I guess what is.
Yeah, they could do that then. So the question was, let's say that they now get to the FAFSA filling it out and somehow realize they forgot to file taxes and now they're going to do it. They would put will file. Chances are the financial aid office will follow up with them or select them for verification. Yeah, so that's possible, I suppose. It's not as common now that we use prior years, so we're asking about tax information from 2 years ago.
Yeah. And then they would put in, I guess, estimated numbers.
Yep, they could put estimated numbers. Yeah.
We have a student whose parents select the student as the head of household. So would that make the siblings dependency first if she's the head of household?
That is not something I'm going to answer. You're going to have to call a tax expert on that because I don't know that that's something you can do as a student file as head of household. So that's out of my purview as a financial aid administrator to answer that level of tax question. I don't know that a student can be filing as head of household. And I
Until the students receive federal financial aid, they should call their tax person, have their taxes amended.
Yeah.
But then ask how much money it would cost, or the parents would have to put in if they amend. And if they amend, is it worth, are you gonna get more money from
The question, just for the recording, is if a student's parents told them to file as head of household, how should they do the FAFSA or handle the taxes? There is a local nonprofit that I've worked with called Prepare Plus Prosper. They're phenomenal. They used to be called Accountability Minnesota, and they do free tax prep for low-income individuals. They also help undocumented folks get ITIN numbers and can do backed taxes of up to several years. Prepare Plus Prosper is the organization. So they do have they have tax clinics, seasonal tax clinics that are around the metro area. And then they also have a main office on University Avenue here in St. Paul. And so which is staffed year round. So that might be a good resource to call and kind of find out, hey, we're in this situation. Someone did these taxes. This is the way they did them. Was that accurate? Yeah. Which is quite honestly, if a financial aid administrator got into a situation like that, I would say 99% of them are going to do that same thing. Say, this doesn't appear correct to me. I don't know that that's correct. I am not a tax preparer. It's not within the purview or scope of my job to tell you they were done incorrectly. This is that link we talked about where you click it and it takes you externally to the IRS database. If the student chooses to do that and the taxes are already filed, in order to do that, we'd have to have this FSA ID piece. So I'm not going to do that. And I'm just going to skip the DRS right now. But what it would do is it would take you to the IRS website. A pop-up would come up. It would say, you're leaving the federal student aid. Are you sure you want to do this? You'd have to accept. And then you'd enter in the information. There is a really good FSA video that gives a demo of how that piece works if you're interested. For this, we're just going to put in some numbers. Oh, that's probably too many. That's a lot. They probably won't get anything. We'll give them a little bit less income.
We had that problem.
So Megan, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so these two numbers should add up to the previous number, correct?
Not always.
Not always.
No, not always. The adjusted gross income does not necessarily equal the sum of the two parents' incomes.
Okay, so this number could be added up lower than
Yep.
the previous. Okay.
Yep, because there are other items on the tax form between line 7 where you put the wages and what used to be line 21. I don't know what it is on the new one because I don't have it memorized, maybe 10. That could be at play, like business income, for example. Yep, so on these questions, thank you for mentioning that. What you want to do is just look at the tax form add up the lines, put it in there. And then there's the question as well. But you're really just looking at line 1, and then you go to Schedule 1, which is new with those new tax forms, and look at line 12 and line 8. I believe line 12 is business income, and I believe line 18 is farm income. This one I think is tied to an LLC or an independent business or business taxes.
And Megan, if we don't have a Schedule 1 in your tax folder for a Schedule 1065,
Yep.
that's part of the addition, are we just to assume it's 0?
On the 1040 form, and there, if you look, if you Google IRS tax decoder, I think it's called, there are some resources like that. But on the 1040, if they filed a Schedule 1, there's a line or like a blank space, and if there's a number there, it means they're supposed to have a Schedule 1. For the Schedule 2, I believe there's a checkbox that it will say, like, if you have a Schedule 2, and there's a checkbox if there is one. And so the tax software should now be updated to handle that, and then professional preparers should be aware of that as well.
So 1040s will tell you if you have.
Yep, if you have one of those schedules, yep.
Going back to my previous question though, because like, it tells you the line, but the thing is if they filed jointly, right? That means that that's their portion of that number. So I have to split that number.
Yep, but that's where you look at the W-2 if they have a W-2. Yep. 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 Yeah, and I think that's what the directions tell you, is to look at the W-2.
So then I guess my question is just on that line, right? That line that it says we look at is one number, but when I add a W-2, should that equal that line? So for instance, 1040 line 1, right?
Yep. Okay, so the question is, if the student's parent has multiple W-2s, should the parent or both parents, the sum of all their W-2s equal what is on line 1 of the taxes? And yes, that's correct. If it doesn't, it means they did not give all their W-2s to their tax preparer, or that maybe they forgot to give them one. But it should be the sum of all the W-2s for both parents, or if it's an individual taxpayer, should equal line 1. And on the old tax forms, that was line 7.
Is there any other, because that was something that my friends did find, they were like, no, that's all W-2s.
Yep, that's correct. Everything on line 1 comes from W-2s.
So they must have did something wrong.
Yeah, there could have been an error there, or a mistake. Yep.
Can I ask about the Schedule 1 piece again?
Yeah.
So, can you just help me? I was Googling what it is, and it's like gambling expenses and educator expenses and like a variety of things. What word should I use to explain to a parent why?
I would use the FAFSA word. So the question was, what is the Schedule 1 for?
Yeah.
And how should I explain it to a parent? I would get the FAFSA words of what they use. It's in this, the paper FAFSA, what the Schedule 1 is.
Why does FAFSA want to know?
Okay, so the reason the Schedule 1 matters, like what we talked about in the beginning, is that's what's tied to the simplified needs analysis. So it used to be, did you file a 1040A or 1040EZ? It's now, did you file a Schedule 1? So that question is involved with the simplified needs analysis. Because this change to the tax forms was not a U.S. Department of Education FAFSA change. It was a tax change under the IRS.
Okay.
And so we have to find a way to adjust our system to match their reality with the taxes.
So that affects then, just like from a layperson, that affects how, in what way they look at with the 1040.
Yep, whether or not they consider assets.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. There is also a don't know button
Oh, okay.
if they don't know, or if you don't know. I'm just going to throw that one out there. Okay, I'm going to go through this next part. We may not have time to do the DREAM Act at this point because of the volume of questions, but I want to make sure we get all your questions answered.
Can I ask a question about that, if you can go back, about the Schedule 1? So say a student, so it seems like, like our students are like on free and reduced lunch. Say they didn't file a Schedule 1, but the question about free and reduced lunch doesn't pop up unless you say yes or I don't know.
That question actually was earlier, the question about,
No,
no, but the question about free or reduced lunch came a step earlier, so that was already asked.
if you say I don't know.
You mean, do you want me to push next?
Yes. Wait, yeah.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. If you say next, sorry. If you say next, and you say I don't know, it pops up.
This one?
The second one. It pops up there. Yeah. So I was asking why did it pop up there? And it doesn't, Yeah. If you say, yeah.
This is related to the dislocated worker piece.
But that question doesn't pop up unless you say.
This question was actually already asked earlier as well. Yep.
Where?
When we were doing the question about the, right before the dependency status, it asked this question as well. So and it has to do with the smart technology embedded into the FAFSA, how it asks certain questions or doesn't.
I've done that. Yeah, I've done it too. That question pop up anywhere else other than this part. I think that's true. Like I always wonder why that question doesn't pop up all the time. Yeah. I've not seen it anywhere else. Yeah. It doesn't pop up. Unless I'm wrong.
I'm just going to check on the order on the paper FAFSA when they put it in. Because I do know the skip logic can impact the order in which questions are asked and which questions are seen. So in the paper FAFSA, that question about the means tested programs comes up right after household size for the dependent student. So if they were an independent student, my assumption is that question would come up at that same point in time, right after the household size question. Oh, actually, step 5 for the student. At any time in 1819, did you or anyone in your household receive these benefits? So let's see if we get to it at the later part. There was another part where it popped up already when we were doing this. I just can't remember, since we've gone back and forth between so many questions, which part it was at. What that one does is it does the auto zero EFC, so it does make a difference. But I know that it's asked. I mean, I did the FAFSA demo for 2 months with the feds this summer, and I had it every time. It might be because of how low their income is right away that it knows. I'm just going to check and see if it comes in this other part.
Or should it come up first? Because that way it saves everybody the process of actually entering in the low income.
No, this was you have the option of entering something. And to be honest, like I said, since we've gone back and forth through so many of these questions, I don't know which path we're down anymore, whether it's the simplified needs or not, or the auto zero, but I did see that question pop up. But it's something I can also, we can find out and send out to the group at which point it asks that. Or we can look back at the recording because I know that it did come up once before we started switching back and forth. But I know it doesn't skip it. It might be that, whoops. So we confused it so much that it won't let us use it anymore. So what I would probably do is go to that public demo site and do the different scenarios, like maybe an example of a student that you've worked with, and see which path it leads you down to get those questions and which it doesn't. It's possible that it skipped them because it already knew that it was going to be a 0 EFC.
I did, we had a FAFSA night on Tuesday, and it was like, and we have FAFSA Tuesdays every Tuesday at Washburn, and I was like really curious about why that only pops up if we answer those questions differently, but it doesn't pop, because I remember last year, it would be there all the time, regardless of, because we didn't have that schedule one, but now that we did have schedule one, and I was like, I don't know, no, that automatically pops up, but if I go back and say, no,
To
if I just say no, it will, so without having that, and that, I was curious about.
Well, when we just did it, it popped up when we did the dislocated worker. That's when it showed up. It didn't pop up. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah, if you want to put that in an email and send it, we can definitely send it to FAFSA to ask them, you know, how that path is different now or how that's been altered. Yeah. If you want to send it to, actually, Kat or Beth, who organized the event, we can definitely look into it further and find out why. And it might be the income piece, or but yeah, we kind of broke the demo site. So no, that's fine. I mean, it's so the parts that we kind of skipped through, just so for those of you who are newer, is you know, it should walk you through, you know, the paper FAFSA, kind of similar order. It's going to ask a series of questions about the parent assets and the student assets. Sometimes it will give them the option of not answering those. They don't have to answer them if they've gone down. There's 3 paths: regular needs analysis, simplified, and auto 0. So that's where that skip logic happens within the application, where some questions are asked of some students and not asked of others. So it doesn't mean that every student you file a FAFSA with will see the exact same questions. And that's supposed to be the smart technology to have, so that it's not as overwhelming and that we're not asking students and families for things that they don't need to be filling. So if you do see that one student has some questions and another one doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong. It just might mean that they were able to skip some of the questions, that something was, some sort of information they provided quickly determined something for them. And you know what I'm thinking now that we're discussing that? It might have been when we were doing that homeless question that the computer thought we were going down that path. And we did previous so many times to look at what the different answers were, that if you are on that homeless path, I do believe that's one of the auto 0s, which would make sense, right? You know, that they would say, well, the student in that situation. So I think it's because that demo site got confused by us doing it so many times. Those need-based questions, sometimes aid administrators will look at those too, just as a point of reference, or maybe if they, you know, want to do some outreach to students who maybe have food insecurity issues. So that's kind of the FAFSA demo. Again, it is public. So if you want to go out and, you know, do some scenarios with staff at your school or your community org, you're more than welcome to do that. There's current year information as well as next year information within that application demo system. Also, if you're curious about that student aid report, I believe they have a demo of that out there, or an example. So if you want to see what your students get, we do have, we're not going to show the video today due to time purposes, but there is a second set of workshops. We did this same workshop yesterday in this room, and today in February, my colleagues Kat and Beth are organizing another 2 set of workshops called After the FAFSA What's Next, or I think it might be titled I Filed My FAFSA Now What? And so that's kind of going to talk a little bit more about the verification process, a little bit more about the tax transcript versus tax forms. So if you're interested in those things, be sure to attend. So if you recall at the very beginning of our conversation, I said that in the state of Minnesota, there are two ways to apply for financial aid. The FAFSA is one way, the Minnesota DREAM Act is the other way. Now we're going to shift gears to talk about the Minnesota DREAM Act program. The FAFSA is held at the federal level. It's a federal process. The Minnesota DREAM Act is held at the state level. So it's operated out of our agency here at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. It's a state aid program. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the nuances within that program and that application. For those of you who are not familiar with it, undocumented students or students without lawful or legal status in the United States are not eligible to file the FAFSA. If their parent or guardian is undocumented, but the student themselves is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, they are eligible to file the FAFSA and should be filing the FAFSA because the FAFSA, again, gets you access to federal student aid. The parent in that situation should be entering all zeros on the application. Sometimes it's a little bit finicky and it won't believe you all zeros, but if you hit submit a couple times, it generally then works. It's just kind of an anomaly with that. Undocumented students can apply to public colleges and universities in every state in the country except for two, which have specifically prohibited it in their state statutes. So their state laws do not allow for that opportunity. And then there are a number of states which has more recently been growing in numbers that do allow students who are undocumented to meet that state's definition of a resident student. So if you think about financial aid always from the perspective of the source it comes from, for federal aid, the feds get to make the rules about who gets the money, how much they get, what are the eligibility criteria. For state financial aid, each individual state has their own set of state law or state statute that determines that eligibility. So these are the states on the slide there that do offer in-state tuition. There are 6 states in our country that offer grant programs to undocumented students. And our state is one of them. We've had our state DREAM Act since 2013. New York was the most recently passed one that happened just last year. There is not a federal DREAM Act. So if students are asking about that, it's been proposed 11 times, it has not yet passed. As far as the Minnesota State DREAM Act, it's actually technically called the Prosperity Act in law. It's more commonly known to students as the Minnesota DREAM Act. And we are now into our 5th cycle working with this grant program. As I mentioned, it's administered here through the Office of Higher Education. And so we are creating the actual application. We support the student database. And in a lot of regards, we work as the financial aid office when we determine the grant eligibility and do the verification process. And then we work with our campus and community partners to help facilitate that. The Minnesota DREAM Act requirements and statute are that a student attends a Minnesota high school for at least 3 years, that they graduate from either a Minnesota high school or earn a GED within the state, and that they register with the U.S. Selective Service if they're males. And we follow the same piece with the feds as assigned at birth. The last piece, which is written into our state law, is related to applying for a lawful path, or sometimes you will hear in the media, a path to citizenship. This is what that is in reference to. That process currently does not exist, so there's no documentation that we ask of from the student. If you'll note by looking at these 3 basic requirements, receiving DACA is not required. DACA is a federal program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I'm sure many of you have heard about it in the news. The Supreme Court just heard a case on it earlier this week. And so there is a lot of changes happening with that program. New applicants aren't currently eligible to apply. Only renewal applicants can. And we're waiting to see what happens with the program as far as if it could be expanded or changed, or if the program will end. Our state statute is not tied to it. Some of those other states, they do have in their state statute their statute tied to the DACA process. So depending on what happens, they might need to make a technical amendment to their state statute or change something. Ours doesn't require it.
Is that 3 consecutive years in a Minnesota high school?
The question was, is it 3 consecutive years? No, it doesn't have to be 3 consecutive years, just 3 years. In our state, there are actually 10 ways to meet the definition of a resident student. Some states, they only have one definition. It might just be live here for 12 months. In our state, there's 10 ways to become a resident. The Minnesota Dream Act is one of those 10 ways. Prior to the passage of the Dream Act, the other 9 ways, every single one of them said, be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident and. When the Dream Act passed, that introductory language to each of those 9 residency requirements was stripped from the state statute, and so it no longer appeared. What that means is that other students may potentially qualify if they don't have 3 years of attendance at a Minnesota high school. So for example, that's something with Kat's computer. So for example, if the student maybe doesn't have the 3 years of high school attendance here, but they were lawfully present, which would be probably DACA, or legally residing, which would be under some sort of visa, they could become a resident of the state if they graduate from a Minnesota high school while under documentation. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of convoluted, but basically what it means is that the DREAM Act language specifically references the U.S. Code Federal Section 8, which is tied to all of everything related to immigration, and basically says if you have legal status in the country, you don't qualify for the Minnesota Dream Act. So it really is for undocumented students. And when we look at those other residency definitions, we're saying if you're under some sort of status and you graduate from a Minnesota high school, you qualify. Or if you're under some sort of status and you reside in Minnesota for 12 months without going to a post-secondary institution, you qualify. And so we do have a variety of different students who fall into that. We have some students from Kenya or Somalia who's just fallen out of status and lost track of paperwork or don't have the paperwork and never got it passed down from parents or family members. We have some folks from Canada. We have folks from China. We have all different kinds of folks. Most of our students, though, I would say the vast majority who get the Minnesota Dream Act are qualifying under the Minnesota Dream Act residency criteria. We do have some non-traditional age students who have DACA, who maybe didn't go to high school here, but now reside in our state and are working here and raising their families or living here and want to go to college, and so they could potentially qualify. The Minnesota Dream Act application, again, it's a state-based application. It is online, like the FAFSA. There are some things that make it the same as the FAFSA process, and there's some things that are different. We do try to follow along with that FAFSA process as closely as we can so that all of our students have a similar experience and they're having a similar experience as their college-going peers. And so we open up the Dream Act cycle on October 1st each year, just like how the FAFSA opens. We follow prior year, just like the FAFSA does. All of the things that we talked about earlier today related to dependency overrides, related to professional judgment, all of those same things apply for Minnesota Dream Act students. It's an annual application that's also similar. The application is different in that it has to be completed in one sitting. So you can't complete part of the application and then later log back in. It's also something where there is no federal student aid ID because, again, it's not a federal process, it's a state process. So we certify that by the click of a box. That's kind of how they certify it. Data retrieval tool, again, that's a federal process, so that's not an option within the Minnesota Dream Act application. Verification, we do 100% verification for the Minnesota Dream Act students. So we collect 1040s from all students, and then if they are dependent students, we collect them from the parents as well. This is a text that appears similar to what you saw with the FAFSA, kind of what do you need when you sit down to do the application. We tell them right away you have to do it in one sitting, so make sure you have it all with you. If for any reason you're working with a Minnesota Dream Act student and they realize that they made a mistake, we literally have only about 3 people in our office, an agency of 65 that touch this program. So we just work individually with those students and families, and we correct their applications on their behalf. So we can do that for them if they realize they made a mistake.
So they call you?
Yep, we have a Minnesota Dream Act email, or they can call our number, which is at the end of the presentation. Just like the FAFSA, we run 2 aid years at a time. And so right now, we have the current 1920 academic aid year. We also just opened in early October the 2021 application cycle. They're both on the same page, so it's important students know which one they're selecting. Both the FAFSA and the Minnesota DREAM Act require that the applications received no later than the 30th day of the term for our state grant program, which is our primary need-based program here in the state of Minnesota. This just kind of gives you an idea of what the application looks like. If you revert to Lea en Español, that will convert the entire web page to Spanish. We do have an interpreter service for other languages. Predominantly Spanish is the language that we get requests for, though. And I'm just going to show you real quickly. I'm now flipped to our web page. Just give you a quick review of what it looks like. We have the same kind of similarly worded privacy notice as we saw on the FAFSA site. And then you see we have in English and Spanish some both the question as well as the help text, that will pop up. And then they can read through that. If they do on this first question say that I'm a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, they'll get text that says you should be filing the FAFSA. So we will direct them. We do also sometimes have students who have a change of status mid-year, and so then we'll work with the financial aid office and the student for how to handle that. Other than that, the majority of the questions follow the exact same process flow as the FAFSA, the exact same order. If the student doesn't have a social security number, we assign an applicant ID. And as long as they apply with the same name, date of birth, the following year, we should be able to sync up the application and see that it's the exact same student. And then they don't need to resubmit documentation like the high school transcript again the following year. We should only need it one time. So that gives you kind of a glimpse of what the application looks like. Again, very similar to the FAFSA questions. We have maybe 2 or 3 questions that are slightly different. We do ask one question related to if the student has DACA or not, and that's related to if they have a work permit. And the reason we do that is so that we can share with the school that they're able to award that student work study. So students who complete the Minnesota DREAM Act application, they can receive all of the same state financial aid benefits that any other student who files the FAFSA can. They're just administered slightly different on campus. The student can select up to 10 schools. And what that means is that those 10 schools have access via an online secure database to view that student's application information. And then what we will tell our community partners on the campus level is best practices would be that you're incorporating the aid we calculate on the state grant side into your aid package on campus. They have access to see our document tracking screen where maybe we've received the tax forms but we're missing the transcripts. We do have a lot of financial aid community partners who will, put that in their own tracking system. So just like the FAFSA filing, students get a follow-up email every 2 weeks saying you need to turn this in. They'll ask the DREAM Act students. And then those campuses just send the information to us for them. We also have a lot of high schools who will just send in, if they know their students doing the DREAM Act, they'll maybe just send us, okay, these 10 students I've worked with, I know they're doing the DREAM Act. I'm just gonna send the Office of Higher Ed all their transcripts at the end of the academic year because we do collect the final transcript. The unusual circumstances, this is something where, again, we do have some, especially with this population, unusual or special circumstances where we are doing a professional judgment. Some of them are related to dependency override. That's the most common one that we're doing. But we would be handling that here. So we act as a financial aid office for that purpose.
Can I
Yep.
ask a question? So this is based on if they're applying to Minnesota college or university. So if they wanted to apply to one of the other states that have the DREAM Act, they have to follow those expectations.
They would not qualify because if you think about it again, whoever gives the money makes the rules. Our state financial aid program, our main program is called the state grant. We do have several other programs, but they're not transportable, so you can't bring them outside the state. So the way that our state statutes are written is investing in Minnesota schools and Minnesota students going to Minnesota schools. Some states allow their state grant to go with the student wherever they go. Ours does not. For those other states in that first slide we looked at that have in-state tuition, it's based on that state's residency definition, which chances are if you're working with a Minnesota high school student who then goes to Wisconsin, they don't have one, but if they did, Wisconsin would not consider them a resident for their DREAM Act because they're not a resident of that state. Yeah, so it definitely limits the options for students. That being said, one of the benefits that we offer as a state agency is interstate tuition reciprocity. Minnesota DREAM Act students are eligible for that. So if a DREAM Act student wanted to go to North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa Lakes Community College, or Wisconsin public schools, they could get in-state tuition through our interstate tuition reciprocity agreement. Or if they wanted to go to Manitoba, which I have had a couple DREAM Act students do, they can go there and get in-state tuition. Yep. These are the documentation, application materials that every DREAM Act student has to turn in. A copy of the high school transcript, the tax filing information. If they're not tax filers, they turn in W-2s. If their employer didn't provide them a W-2, we can accept a written statement. If it's not written in English, then we work on translating it. And if they want to be considered for work study, which is a campus-based program, we get a copy of the work permit. We previously talked about the selective service. The only one piece I would say about that related to Minnesota DREAM Act is if they don't have a social security number, they have to print the form. It has to be sent via paper mail to our office because we have to have the wet signature. So it can't be faxed, it can't be sent as an email attachment. And the reason we have it send them to us is because the process to get it on the selective service website can take 6 to 7 weeks. So we just process it in our office first. These are those state financial aid programs that we administer out of our office. All of these would be eligible to Minnesota DREAM Act students, just like they would be to any other Minnesota resident student. However, work study does require the work permit. And the self-loan for all students requires either a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident cosigner. So that can be a barrier for some students. We talked about the reduced tuition rate, which is a benefit that DREAM Act students can get. One thing to keep in mind for Minnesota DREAM Act students is that for all students actually, the state grant does not typically cover all of tuition. And so it means that there will be a gap for most of our students, especially if they're Minnesota DREAM Act students. But there are many colleges, both in the public sector and the private sector, that are offering institutional aid for them. We do keep a list on our website when we're aware of resources, on our resources for undocumented students of different organizations that offer scholarships. Definitely, we encourage them to talk to their high school for any scholarships they could potentially get at that level. And then we do have some resources with some community partners that we put on our website as well, on that resources for undocumented students webpage.
Where they'll help them fill out the DREAM Act?
Nope, it's more just that they have a different life situation where they might need other resources.
Oh,
And so
I see.
these, if they
Okay.
have things related to their changing their paperwork or their status, or community action networks, things like that. And then that number you had asked me about is right here. So we have a grant unit here at the Office of Higher Ed. The phone line is answered from 8 to 4:30. This is the phone number, option 2. And so if you have questions, you can definitely give that phone number a call. If they're very nuanced federal questions, like the FSA ID won't work or something like that, chances are we'll forward you on to the feds. I mean, we know basic FAFSA stuff, of course, but if it's something related to the system's not working for the student, it's more of a federal piece. Yes. Yeah, and we do actually, the question was, can graduate students apply for the Minnesota DREAM Act? And the answer is yes. We do actually have quite a few graduate students at the U of M Twin Cities that are getting in-state tuition via the Minnesota DREAM Act. Most of the schools in the public sector, accept our residency determination, and so they'll just automatically grant in-state tuition to those students. Yeah. And there was another question somewhere? No? Okay. Well, if you think of other questions, you can definitely make sure to connect with each other, connect with us, connect with Beth as well as Kat regarding any of the concerns you have for your students. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Couple housekeeping things. We will be sending out the presentation electronically along with some of the links and the toolkit items that she mentioned, and the handouts and where to find them. I'll create a couple, I'll create it and then I'll send it out. So yes, that is needed. Alright, thanks for coming and thank you to Megan for doing such an awesome job with this presentation and answering questions.
Thank you. I was trying to go to that stop button and I couldn't find it again. It wouldn't open again.
Yeah. Do they know that we have outreach presenters that will go to their school for FAFSA nights or this room?
Hold on. Okay, I'm not crazy, right? Okay, we try to put that out as often as possible. But I can throw that in.
I think you should because I was talking to her and she's like, I had no idea that you had that.
Yeah, and Kat is the one, who was here.
Yeah, I
She's
know.
the one that reads. So.
I'm a presenter, so that's how I know.
Oh,
Yeah, so I often find that nobody knows.
So what is your name again? Jackie and Beth.
Hi, Beth.
And then there was
We're
another.
supposed to be finishing here.
Not yet.
We have never had a meeting, so I have no idea.
All right. Well, thanks for saying that, and I'll put that out. Make sure to put that out in the recap. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.